Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing, man?
Afternoon, Nick and John. Good to be with you guys again. Yeah, doing well, thanks. Let's see what we can figure out today about South Africa's food security and the inspection of such important issues in the country.
Indeed, and of course we also have CEO of the Institute of Race Relations, Dr. John Endres. John, how are you doing?
Very well, thanks. Thanks for inviting us back. Hi, Chris. Hello, Nick. And hello, viewers.
Very good to have you back with us. So I first want to start off with a story we're not going to talk about, but one that has delighted me to no end. Some of you may remember media reporting a while ago about some men who are allegedly posing as food inspectors to get free food out of KFC. They would show up to a KFC, demand free food, saying that they were a KFC-approved food inspector, eat the meal, and then disappear. Well, initially, KFC dismissed this as simply an urban legend and not really true, but it has since emerged that, in fact, there are people running the scam, and as a result, KFC has been forced to hire a private inspector to investigate who these people are who are eating for free at KFCs. So, pro tip for anyone wanting to get in on that thing, they still don't know who's the mystery food inspector. Anyway, so our first story for today. Yeah, go ahead, John.
The guy with the clipboard making notes, as he goes to KFC to eat. That's the one.
Indeed. All right. So, well, the last thing I'll say on that is I wish South Africans are very creative and entrepreneurial people. I just wish sometimes we used our powers for good. Because think of the things we could accomplish. Okay, our first story is about our what's the cool word that the journalists often use? Embattled public protector, who is currently facing an impeachment hearing before Parliament. She has had more stunning accusations leveled against her by the Chief Operating Officer of the Public Protector's Office, Basani Baloyi, who has been testifying as to why she should be impeached for a while now. Baloyi has claimed that Mkhwebane was essentially a complete tyrant in the sense that she had a very authoritarian style of leadership, and this went to quite ridiculous extremes. So Baloyi said during their testimony, "I have worked with various MECs and ministers, but when the public protector walks from her office to the boardroom, we had to rise. And I found an anomaly because this is not a person who walks in as an executive authority. Most of the MECs and ministers I've worked with did not actually do that. I just felt that when you are at that particular level, you need to deal with matters in a manner that you understand your team and understand your environment. The public protector's leadership style was authoritarian. She demanded to be addressed as madam. She must be bowed down to, quite literally. Her style of leadership was characterized by inflexibility, irrationality, and a failure or refusal to treat her staff with dignity and respect." So let me start with you, John. I can just imagining Mkhwebane walking into an office and forcing people to bow before her. It's something like a cartoon character villain would do, but apparently, according to her Chief Operating Officer, this is how she was leading the Public Protector's Office. What do you make of all this?
Such an interesting little tidbit. I think it's not a hugely important story for the development of South Africa, but I think there are some aspects to it that are worth exploring. And one of these is whether the exercise of power granted by virtue of a position in the state by these means is a reflection of insecurity rather than a sense of confidence. And I think this is probably exactly what it was in this case. If Mkhwebane was confident and self-assured and a charismatic leader, then she would have no need to request people to bow down and show signs of deference as they approached her. But the fact that she did do so, I think, is a sign that she was not feeling secure in her position. She realized that she was maybe underqualified, maybe compromised, but not the right person for the job. And so she was trying to inflate her own sense of worth in the eyes of others by making use of little tricks like this. And I think it is actually, it's on the one hand, it's funny, but it's also a bit pathetic for somebody to have to do that sort of thing. The second aspect, which I think is important here, is that her role is that of the public protector, which is that she is the person protecting citizens from the state when the state does things wrong. And what she's doing here is, in a sense, elevating herself, and putting herself in the position of a queen, rather than as a person of the people who is there to help the people. And it goes, I think, contrary to what the ethos of that kind of office should be, for her to assert herself in this undignified manner. So not very impressive on her part. Nicholas.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that point you make about the sort of insecurity is key here, because this really does speak to someone who is not in firm control of their surroundings, and is trying to compensate with what's that term that Jordan Peterson uses? Disagreeableness, or lack of agreeableness. According also to the COO, she also set unrealistic deadlines and had a complete lack of trust in senior staff members. And Chris, I just want your thoughts on this in general, but also, from the little bit of time I had in local government, but also in, following the news closely over the years, I really do get the sense that a lot of government departments are have extremely toxic internal work cultures, that people are very high, that they're very hierarchical, that there's lots of kissing up and kicking down, that there's lots of suspicion and plotting and treachery, like the kind of worst sort of office politics that you can imagine. And I think that this is also a significant contributor as to why there's brain drain in the country, because even if you're like completely non-political, even if you're not that bothered by the corruption, if you go into the office and everyone is trying to stab you in the back all the time to take your position, well, you're not really going to stick around. You're either going to go to the private sector or leave the country if you're a skilled professional. Chris, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, when I first read this, I had in my mind's eye the image of Dolores Umbridge from Harry Potter, and that sort of the frills and trying to impose yourself by virtue of your station, but not because you've necessarily earned that station or earned that relationship with your colleagues. So it's a case of certain expectations and certain demands without having earned maybe that level of respect. And it's a very superficial level of sort of respect and authority, trying to force it on people in that way. I do think it unfortunately points to, we often, I mean, in our line of work, we get to analyze, we have the opportunity to analyze policies and government plans and the very top-down point of view in terms of how the ruling party, as just one example, is trying to shape society and it's how it thinks things should go. But you also just see people in positions of power, how they act day to day and how that impacts on people's lives and how that might impact on the institutions themselves. So it's this case of very concrete manifestation of how some people are in these positions and then how they're abusing them, where they should be public servants, but in the reverse is where they consider the public to be their servants in many ways. I think it's very unfortunate, but it does point to that tension, I think, that is continuing to build across state institutions as well, probably as a lot of state institutions themselves are under more pressure. So this could also be a manifestation of the public protector herself feeling under more political pressure and then trying to move the locus of responsibility and culpability onto others underneath her, whereas she should be actually fulfilling her own duties and fulfilling her own mandate as public protector. But you see when people in high positions of power fail to discharge their duty accordingly, they move that responsibility onto others and blame others, try and find ways to hide it, etc. So unfortunate situation, probably pointing, I think, to a speedy, maybe not speedy enough, but speedy exit for the public protector. The system is not sustainable, I don't think.
Let's hope so, although it remains to be seen how MPs actually will vote. John reminds me that there was a great article written on this by Gareth van Onselen in Politics Web about the difference between respect versus deference. And just kind of on that point more generally, I think Mkhwebane's alleged behavior here, John, is more symptomatic of a problem that I think everyone has seen in government at some time or another, which is this kind of imperial, aristocratic approach to things. We see it in, the massive pile of bodyguards that a lot of senior government officials have following, and that we see it in the massive blue light convoys, in the the sort of entourages and crowd of sycophants that many senior government officials seem to have. It's almost as though people are play acting at being medieval aristocracy, and it seems completely incompatible with our sort of constitutional framework and our republic's sort of essence. Any final thoughts on this, John?
Maybe just the idea that I think it's not universal, even within the ANC, but certainly widespread. But if you consider, how Nelson Mandela interacted with members of the public, I think he certainly had a temper. You knew where he stood with him, but he was, I think, never the kind of guy not to speak to a cleaning person or,
I think he made a big point of that. Actually, a lot of people have stories of whenever Mandela would visit somewhere, he would greet literally everyone there.
Exactly. And I think, there are other ministers as well. I think Cindy Mufamadi is also, he used to be the local government minister and was most recently in charge of the committee on investigating malfeasance at the State Security Agency. I think he's also the kind of guy without airs and graces. And, there are politicians like that. And I do think that in a way that actually matches South African attitudes to hierarchy well. I think, we tend not to be too respectful of authority. And so it's nice when people match that kind of attitude rather than demanding deference as Mkhwebane is doing here.
Definitely. And this is, I think, a warning for any future government once the ANC has passed. I think that there's a very strong temptation to fall into these modes of behavior when you assume power, because anyone coming into these offices often simply attracts their own crowd of sycophants and entourage. Any future non-ANC government is going to have to work very hard to avoid this temptation, because it is a strong one. Okay, let's go on to some comments made by the Limpopo MEC for Health. So the MEC for Health in Limpopo was filmed, and this went around on social media, telling a woman from Zimbabwe that her country, not SA, must take responsibility for her health issues. This woman was complaining to the MEC about some issues she had. And the Limpopo MEC for Health responded, "You're supposed to be with Mnangagwa." That's the president of Zimbabwe. "You're killing my health system. When you guys are sick, you say, let's just cross the Limpopo River. There's an MEC there who's running a charity department. In Limpopo, we have 5.7 million people. 91% do not have medical aid. They are dependent on the state. 9% have medical aid. Instead of using the budget for what it's meant for, you are not even registered anywhere. You are illegal. This is unfair." She, in response to this video going around, said that her comments were taken out of context. She said, "On a daily basis, we have an influx of foreign nationals choking the health system in Limpopo. The situation is getting worse. As a province, we have a backlog of surgical operations. So I started a program called Rural Health Matter to reduce the backlog. It's not xenophobic." So Chris, let me start with you. Yesterday on the show, we talked about how chasing foreigners away is not going to solve our unemployment problem. But on the flip side, I do have sympathy with the MEC for Health in Limpopo here. I would not have put it like she put it, because I think that was a bit rude. Once again, to someone who is not a citizen, but an ordinary person, and you shouldn't be talking down to someone. But still, the point remains. We have a stressed healthcare system. Part of it is because it maybe doesn't have as much money as it needs, but also part of it is because it is extremely badly run and lacks skills. And when we have people from other countries with even worse healthcare systems coming over the border to try and maybe get something from our system, it only stresses things further. What do you make of this, Chris?
Yeah, it is. It was apparently, I missed this in the original reporting from a different story, but apparently it was Zimbabweans who spent 500,000 Rand on skinny jeans at Tembisa Hospital. As just one example of how funds are wasted on inconsequential, frivolous, completely misdirected ends and where they should be spent. That's just one example. In the last 2 years, we can point to the COVID-19 PPE scandals. We can point to former Minister of Health, Willem Kize. I'm not aware that any Zimbabweans or other foreign nationals were involved in any of this wastage. So that might be the first starting point for the MEC. Secondly, fixing the systems and the incentives and the infrastructure. So it's one thing to say and to acknowledge the reality that Zimbabweans, for example, come to South Africa to work and then to access healthcare. It's another thing to say that the amount of healthcare opportunities, the amount of positions in a given hospital, that all of that is simply fixed and can never be improved, can never be increased, can never be incentivized in better ways. I think that misses the fundamental point of why is the system so strained in the first place? How did we get to the situation? It's very easy to find scapegoats and to blame groups and individuals when your own level of taking responsibility and improving things is lacking, and when your own decisions and that by your party have led the public healthcare system into the dire state where it is at the moment. So this can continue, and it probably will continue, because I don't see fundamental reform in terms of the ruling party and its views of healthcare policies and priorities. For example, the NHI adding more bureaucracy and centralization onto both public and private healthcare will not solve any of these fundamental issues in public healthcare facilities. It will make things only worse, and then you'll see more verbal and possibly physical attacks against foreigners. To me, it indicates a fundamental misunderstanding of the causes of why we're in the situation, and I don't think you're going to solve anything by trying to find new scapegoats and shifting the responsibility for improving things onto other people.
So that point is well taken, Chris, because obviously, as you say, there are a lot of problems, and we could be doing a lot better with what we already have. But I do think that even if our system was running well, we would probably suffer at least some stresses from the fact that we have so many very poor neighbors around us in everywhere from Zimbabwe to Lesotho to Mozambique. John, what are your thoughts on this issue? You were looking at our Bill of Rights just before the show.
Yeah, so maybe tying on to the point you were making, I do think that South Africa sometimes is a victim of its own success. As much as we point out the shortcomings and failures of the South African state, by comparison with many neighboring countries and those further up in Africa as well, I think South Africa is still a gleaming beacon that people flock to because things are still a lot better here than they are in many other countries. And that is sort of understandable human nature to go where things are better. But as Chris was saying, I think what we're seeing here is a bit of scapegoating towards foreigners, whereas the failings are really deeply embedded within the performance of the South African state itself, and even going deeper than that to the very way in which the Constitution was formulated. So if you go to the Constitution, you will see that there is a basic right of access to healthcare enshrined in the Constitution, as well as a right of access to education. And these rights are not limited to citizens. It says everyone has the right to. And that means that the MEC actually has no choice. The Constitution is telling her that she does need to provide these services to anyone who's in South Africa. It doesn't matter what status they have, or whether they're citizens or residents or illegal immigrants or foreigners, or whatever the case might be. This is what the Constitution says. And I think we've been critical on occasion about the fact that the Constitution is so broad in trying to accommodate everybody's wishes that it will create situations where it becomes unaffordable to do so. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing here. So the ambition, the scope, the generosity embedded within the Constitution is really admirable in a way, but it also leads to huge costs. And sometimes it leads to situations like this where those costs are so extensive that the state doesn't know how to fulfill its obligations. But that is the obligation that the Constitution places it under. It's a difficult situation. And then you add to that, of course, the question of immigration, which is not being handled very well. So it's leading to these conflicts and dilemmas. Nick?
Right. My first response to the MEC would be to say you should probably talk to your own party in national government and ask them to perhaps take the border and border security more seriously. Because, as you say, that issue is not being managed particularly well, and there are a lot of people who are here illegally because A, the border is corrupt, B, it's not properly policed and enforced. I would also add to that, people who have registered themselves here legally don't then suddenly kick them out when they've been living here for years and contributing. But anyway, Chris, any final thoughts on this topic?
Just to add a possible thought experiment. So accept the premise that it's because of illegal immigrants that the public healthcare facilities have declined to where they are. But the ideology that guides the governing party's policies in terms of healthcare reforms isn't going to change. So assume that burden isn't there from illegal immigration. I foresee, even if you remove those individuals, you would still see the progressive decline of public healthcare facilities, because that is necessarily a consequence of the ideology of the ruling party, where it needs to manage, for example, everyone's healthcare and provide for everyone's healthcare. You're going to see those consequences. And then you'll find other scapegoats. So maybe Afrikaners, English people, Zulus, Xhosas, vendors, Christians, Muslims. There will always be a scapegoat for the state to put its failures onto.
That's a good reminder there. All right, let's move on to our last story, and that is that inflation has hit a 13-year high record as food prices have been going up. Annual consumer inflation has reached its highest level in 13 years, increasing to 7.8% in July from 7.4% in June. And apparently this is in line with the sort of mainstream view of what inflation was going to be. The consumer price index rose by 1.5% between June and July this year. Annual food inflation is up by 9.7% in July, which is up from 1.6% in June. A lot of this was driven by things like oils and fats, which went up by a third, 36%. Breads and cereals as well by about 10%, slightly over 10%. And various other things, everything from maize meal to macaroni to white bread has gone up slightly. The only thing that's gone down in price at the moment seems to be rice, of the major staple foods. Of course, fuel has been going up a lot, although that seems to have halted now. But John, let me start with you. So my first thing is, how much of this is a South African problem? All over the world, we've seen inflation going on for a while now. It started last year, but has continued, and it's been made worse by the war in Ukraine. How much of this is to do with the South African government's choices? How much of this is to do with the sort of winds of the global economic system?
Yeah, I think this is very much due to what's happening on the international stage. Because within South Africa, we're not really seeing huge demand. This is not an overheating economy that we find ourselves in South Africa, which would be one reason for price increases. I think a lot of that really is coming from abroad in the form of higher fuel prices, the cost of foodstuffs as well, which seem to be the main areas that are being affected by this. It's a really tricky situation, but something that the IR has been saying for a long time is that a small open economy like South Africa is always going to be exposed to shocks from outside. And that makes it even more important to make the South African economy resilient. And that is not what we've got. We haven't got a resilient economy. We've got a weak economy. And that makes us very susceptible to external shocks and makes the effects of those external shocks far more serious than they would be otherwise. We saw that during the COVID crisis as well. That was a terrible shock to countries throughout the world in terms of the lockdowns and the disruption to international trade, etc. But if you're in a vulnerable open economy, those effects become even more serious. In terms of the inflation in South Africa, I think that's going to remain high for a while, despite the Reserve Bank's raising of interest rates. I don't think that in South Africa's case is going to bring inflation under control, because usually the mechanism is that you raise interest rates, so demand comes down, and as demand cools, the pressure on prices also reduces, but our demand isn't so high. So even if we reduce it through higher interest rates, I think inflation is not going to respond to that very much. Nick?
So, Chris, one of the things my dad has been saying is that, this is one of the first times, and I haven't been back, to be fair, to check in the records whether he's entirely correct on this, but it's sort of correct, I think, pretty uncontroversially, that South Africa, at least in the recent while, has tended to have higher inflation than some of the big countries like the UK and the US, and some of these big European countries. And now all of a sudden we're kind of seeing the reverse, in that despite how high our inflation is, it's still in some ways lower than, I think, what's ours now at 7% in the US. It was at around 9%. In the UK, it was also around 9%. Can any of this be attributed to the relative responsibility and sort of restraint of our Reserve Bank? What do you make of this issue?
I think the Reserve Bank has done relatively well, all things considered, to try and retain some measure of protecting the value of the currency in this environment of inflation. But the Reserve Bank can only do so much. And then you look at things, this phenomenon of imported inflation. So things like fuel, for example, sunflower oils, how much of that are we importing into South Africa? Because, again, we haven't done the right policy and ideological decisions over the last 20 years to make ourselves more resilient, to make sure that our manufacturing capacity is better than what it currently is in terms of electricity. Getting some of those basic growth fundamentals right, if we had done some of these basic reforms in the past, we would be in a much stronger position right now. You would have, for example, cheap, reliable electricity to make sure that manufacturing can still happen at a good pace, and you can locally manufacture goods instead of importing those. You can have more gas exploration, for example, to make sure you have other access to other forms of electricity, fixing the railways and the ports. Those inefficiencies, all of that adds costs onto imported goods, and we're simply very reliant on imported, both more imported goods than materials. We're quite lucky with the material side, but imported goods we're pretty much just a consumption economy at this point. So the Reserve Bank can try and do rate hikes up until a point. I do think this will continue through the second half of this year and into the first half of next year, following the trend set by, for example, the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, Britain, and others. But I don't think it's going to go as maybe they plan, because other state institutions and just the government as a whole is too hungry, number one, to really downplay its own spending, so it needs more tax revenue, and number two, we won't see those reforms that really lower other costs and administered costs and increases which feed into other goods in the economy.
John, any final thoughts on this before we close up for today?
Yeah, which is that the Reserve Bank, we've sort of dismissed the idea that higher interest rates in South Africa are going to control inflation in South Africa. But I think the Reserve Bank doesn't have a choice in any case. And the reason for this is that the interest rate differential between South Africa and markets like the United States and the European Union is very important for money inflows into South Africa. So if that gap gets very small, it means that less money will come into South Africa. It will weaken our currency and lead to even more inflation. So as foreign central banks keep hiking rates, South Africa needs to keep pace with that. It can't let the gap between the interest rates get too big. So it is doing the right thing, as tough as it is. And I think it is necessary to do this. But it's a bit of tough medicine and a bitter pill to swallow. But nonetheless, it is the right approach from the central bank. And the South African Reserve Bank is one of the institutions that I really have a lot of respect for, including the governor himself. If you read his speeches, I think he's really one of the good guys in South Africa. Nick?
No, I tend to agree with that. I mean, our colleague Gabriel has occasionally criticized, I think, some of his comments on, I think it was to do with race in schools or something like that. I can't remember exactly what he said. But generally speaking, on economic matters, I think he has been very solid. And this is, I think, a key indicator to watch for the sort of health of South Africa's economy, is that if the Reserve Bank gets muddled with, then we really are in deep trouble, because, as you say, it has been that sort of rock that I think has anchored a huge amount of goodwill. It's sort of our last properly working, properly trusted institution in the country, and long may it last. So with that, I think we're going to close up for today. Thank you very much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed the show, that you found it interesting. Please leave us good reviews on the podcast apps. Please subscribe to us, and please like the video if you're watching on YouTube. And with that, I hope that you all have a wonderful and fantastic day, and we will see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.